All right, here we are. Not the best camera setup and not the best microphone. In fact, I don't have much of either. I'm using a webcam and a inbuilt computer mic. I got my first gray hair earlier today doing another video. So I want to make a lecture right now called the Gray Hair Lecture because I am officially an old man, technically, kind of. 28. Been 28 for only a few months. What? December, January, February, 3 months and change. Eating some nasty mac and cheese with Indian vindaloo spices. Hot. That's why spicy is spice. It's hot. It's not my best cooking, but I'm gonna eat it anyway. So the Western is as a concept is interesting before you even watch a film, because a lot of westerns were made early in the earliest years of Hollywood. Like let's say 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s. Definitely 20s, 30s. And these are either and some of these were pre-Hays Code, so that all these different wild, avant-garde um, happenings, comings and goings on the film set, and then the subject matter was really like licentious sometimes, or elaborate and theoretical and abstract and artistic, because the Hays Code wasn't issued until 1927, and then after then the films became a lot more Christianized and sort of moralistic. Um, that's not to say the movies are bad. They could be a lot of the genres that we know and love were established because of the Hays Code, because there was a limited way to express certain ideas about morals, and so we had to rely on horror movies where there's just you know violence was sort of justified because there was a monster, a sort of force majeure, a life in life caricature of a personality, right? Or in a noir film, you wouldn't have lewd sexual imagery, but you would have a prostitute who would get murdered, but at least she existed technically in the movie as a toned down prostitute. Probably not a very realistic portrayal of one, but the character was written and performed by an actor, so technically existed. The Hays Code sort of formalized the genres, but it made it so that really adventurous filmmaking was sort of like German expressionist films and so on were extremely sidelined, especially, I mean, typically in America, because that was the Hays Code was a Hollywood mechanism, and I'm not even sure it was legally um, bound. It was more that um, the, the large studios unanimously agreed to apply it. Now, this no less applies for westerns. Westerns are interesting, though, even if you don't have any preconceptions, because you have the cowboy in the 1800s, 1860s, 70s, 80s, 90s, whatever, like the old cowboys, even into the 20s. You have cowboys. I mean, I guess you have modern cowboys, but even into the 20th century, there are cowboys. Well, let's say they get worn out after years of wear and tear and abuse by the land, and they retire. Maybe they move to a town with a theater. Guess what? They're going to be 65 years old, but they're going to be watching a movie about a cowboy. And what's even weirder is that they might be watching a movie about a cowboy while World War I is going on. So in the back of their mind, they're thinking about this mechanical war. The site is the sites have never been seen before, and they're just some cowpoke. No, rank it up even more. 20 years. How much is it? 20 or 30? It's 30 years later. Almost 30 years later, right? World War II. So you have a really old cowboy, or maybe just like a later generation of cowboy, but still in the era of the frontier and the Wild West. Someone who grew up there, lived it, and they're in some town, no longer in Wyoming, or maybe they are an established town like Jackson, and they're watching a World War II movie about they could be watching a Western, or they could be watching a movie about World War II, or they could be reading about World War II and observing it from thousands of miles away in the comfort of their own farmland. So this idea that like these Westerns were made for people that lived entirely in some sort of crackpot nostalgia for the Wild West isn't true. There was a pretty long stretch of time when Westerns were made for actual generations that would have remembered the Wild West. So that's something that you have to remember about Westerns. They're not necessarily, popcorn flicks about some sort of fabled era. What is like that, unfortunately, is movies that are about like the Middle Ages, with like Braveheart, or movies about ancient Rome, like Gladiator and classical antiquity, right? Or another one like that was Troy. Also, what's a movie like Braveheart, Kingdom of Heaven? I mean, it's a Ridley Scott movie, all the same, but it's a different take on the Middle Ages. Oh wait, no, the Braveheart was Mel Gibson, of course. Anyway, so those are sort of Judeo-Christian, Manifest Destiny kind of nostalgia films, somewhat. White guy sort of power fantasies, somewhat. Are they valid? I think so. I don't think they're inaccurate as an emotional release or something a white guy should relate to. I think a white guy could relate to those movies, but the westerns were meant to be more authentic because the Wild West was in living memory. I mean, up to a point. And then you find that later on, with these sort of anti-westerns, spaghetti westerns, and psychedelic westerns, these subgenres of westerns, they stop really representing the West as the living memory kind of demanded that it be represented. There's sort of a revisionist. That's the word that the academics use, is a revisionist take on the Wild West, and this is where you get your Clint Eastwood. Eastwood had a lot of opposition because Clint Eastwood, is an incredible filmmaker. He's made tons of successful films. Many of them I like, some of them I don't, but many of them I do like. And as an actor, I like him even more than as like a filmmaker. I like his portrayals. But he got backlash in the 60s, 70s, mid-century, right, 50s, because he was always portraying these anti-hero sort of sleuths and noir kind of level characters, and some maybe the most successful actor in Hollywood history, like John Wayne, didn't really approve of the way he sort of badmouthed effectively the Wild West, whereas something that John Wayne spent his entire life trying to promote. And then here you see someone like Clint Eastwood playing roles that essentially upbraid that very lifestyle and culture. And he did a lot of these films. He did on a foreign dime. He did them in Italy. So it wasn't even like the major motion picture companies were promoting it. So Clint Eastwood was a huge fan of John Wayne, because John Wayne is the biggest movie star of all time, just about. And now Clint Eastwood seems like he's that, right? That's the irony. But he invited Clint Eastwood invited Wayne to work with him And Wayne denied and wrote back an angry letter saying, "Hey, you are fucking with the tradition of the Western genre. It is not about, you know, all this violence. A lot of the later 60s, 70s movies were really violent. Sort of new age of Hollywood had been ushered in, where violence was sort of downplayed and sort of sexed up, and not downplayed, but it was desensitized, And the Hays Code had basically run its course. So that was another thing. Does it matter that the Hays Code ran its course? Maybe it was just a sign that times had changed. I think it was. I don't think it necessarily was a legal issue or whatever. But yeah, these movies started being more licentious again. And they kind of lose some of their folksy charm though. But the problem is with this is that the problem with it is eventually it becomes like really apparent that the Hays Code that what you call it who Clint Eastwood own movies. It becomes really apparent that Clint Eastwood's own movies are like being challenged by the establishment or the anti-establishment, and he's become the establishment. And by the time you get into the 90s, his own style of filmmaking is sort of passe, and he had to start making. It was pressure on him to make, authorial decisions to sort of undermine the personality that he cultivated his entire career. He eventually kind of doubled back. He kind of backpedaled on that once he realized that it would lead to his undoing. But his movie Unforgiven won Best Picture, 1992. Brilliant film. It's got, I think, an original screenplay, or at least it wasn't written by Clint Eastwood. And it had a lot of guilty sort of themes to it that tied into the end of the second millennium and the beginning of the third one. And the 90s was a very guilty time in Hollywood, also in music, culture, far and wide. It was a guilty time. 80s less so. 80s were more smug, by far. In fact, in one of Clint Eastwood's 80s films, he one of the main characters is a priest. It's unusual. And then Outlaw Josie Wales, that was the movie Pale Rider. And then in the 70s, he did his first film that he directed and acted in. Mainly, it was the first one he directed in, called Outlaw Josie Wales. Before that, he was in Sergio Leone movies, Sergio Corbucci movies. Italian was. He was on TV shows for many episodes playing highway patrolman in California. Clint Eastwood was doing a lot of things, and he was Dirty Harry, probably even more famously than the westerns. Really, he was Dirty Harry, I guess some would say. He was a San Francisco detective. Made 5 movies doing that. So he plays this gruff, man's man, kind of like Harrison Ford would, but he's a lot taller than Harrison Ford. So he plays a sort of this indefatigable, undefeated type of guy, strong man, something. And then eventually that becomes passe. People don't want to see the loner with the gun shooting into the situation, making claim on it. They see that as authoritarian, patriarchal, or patriarchal, whichever it is. I can't keep track. But yeah. So then you get westerns that sort of are pulling their shots more. They like Power of the Dog or Godless. Before that, maybe you get some films that have kind of a intense moral message that's brinking on degenerate, like 310 the Yuma or Appaloosa. Not necessarily feminist films, but they're um, not really masculinist. I mean, they're masculine in the sense that there's men who are masculine, but their values are kind of like more dog eat dog and all over the place. And then you get a string of films, like I said, Godless is a limited series on Netflix, very good. It's a really good series, but it has a strange sort of obsession going on with it. And then Power of the Dog is like a big Oscar contender film, came out last year or year before, and that's it's also got this weird obsession. The other one that's worth mentioning is Brokeback Mountain. It's a modern western, but that still qualifies. There are TV shows along the way. Dallas was a show from the 70s into the 90s, very popular, depicted ranching life in Texas, North Texas, or wherever Dallas is, I guess central. Um, Close to North though. Closer than Houston anyway. And you also have nowadays you have a show called Yellowstone. It's been about 5 seasons of that. They had a prequel, 1883, with Sam Elliott. Yellowstone had Kevin Costner. Now, a lot of people don't know Kevin Costner, of course, is in Dances of Wolves, where he was integrated within the Native American tribe. It was a small tribe. Very interesting story. He was a pioneer, white guy, I guess. Kevin Costner. I shouldn't have to say it. His name should say it, but I guess not. And then he integrated more or less, and I think he had a kid, or he got married or something. Anyway, it was a great movie, and then he ends up going in another western called Wyatt. It's called Earp, or Wyatt Earp. And it was a biopic about Wyatt Earp, the gunslinger from the OK Corral, out in Tombstone, Arizona, in the 1800s. Tried and true cowboy story, legendary, and part of history. However, I don't think he got his due until he did this Yellowstone series, 5 seasons. He plays the patriarch, kind of sort of rancher, John Dutton or whatever his name was, and very good performance, consistently, sort of like an appealing, personality. I don't know, just kind of worked, and he had a lot of other actors that held their own. So the whole flying circus was pretty good. And then they had so far. There's 2 series out. One's on Paramount with Harrison Ford, no less, called 1923. I actually kind of like it. I mean, Harrison Ford's pretty good in almost everything, so it's hard not to like it. But I'm surprised that Harrison Ford can be in a movie. And he's not really known for westerns. I mean, he played Indiana Jones, but he's like an archaeologist. But I mean, you could, with Western elements, Western aesthetics, leather, well, leather. He's an archaeologist. They're gonna fetishize the past anyway. Leather fetish, whatever. I didn't mean it like that, but you know what I mean. Different color. Black leather is a fetish. Brown leather is nostalgia. Anyway, Clint Eastwood. So Clint Eastwood sort of stops making, becomes irrelevant. He's very old. Harrison Ford just got back on his game again. He starts playing, just kind of wilding out, rancher in Montana. All these three TV shows are all take place in the same farm in Montana, hypothetically. The other one's got Sam Elliott in it, and that's actually a true blue cowboy show because it's set in 1883. I haven't even watched it yet because I'm not totally sold on Sam Elliott so far. I mean, he's been in a number of westerns. I'm just, as the leading character, I'm not sold on it so much. Harrison Ford, though, I was sold before I even watched it, right? So I mean, everything he's been in has been like gold to me. So yeah, and then that's what westerns look like now. They're not as popular as they used to be. There used to be so many of them, and they used to be shot at left and right. And the cool part was a lot of times they were shot on location, which is like not an easy thing to do, especially back then. And they spared like no expense to do it. And they would go out to Arizona and shoot at Monument Valley. And they, all these funny names of these movies have percolated throughout the years. So I started circulated and percolated. High Noon, 310 to Yuma, The Magnificent Seven, The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance. Yeah, I mean, if these ring a bell, I mean, some of these are considered revisionist, yeah, anti-westerns or the early anti-westerns. Although some of them are considered bona fide, tried and true, black and white 50s, 60s westerns, sort of late, but still, staunchly in that category, kind of. Not really, but for the modern audience, they would seem that way, especially unversed in Western film making or film tradition, because the genre has been around for a long time compared to other film genres. And it survived for a long time too. Somehow, the other thing is you have John Wayne was a good example of someone who just pumped out movies. They're all kind of quality was sort of hit or miss. You had True Grit's a classic. You had another one, Rio Lobo, Rio Bravo, I think. Rio Lobo definitely. You have he's in tons of films. He was in Man Who Shot Liberty Valance. A lot of these names, they blur together. And you forget, of course, that some of these movies blur the lines between drama and comedy, or tragedy and comedy, right? Because we don't watch a lot of westerns these days, but a lot of westerns in its heyday were comedies, and they're primarily comedies, and so you think that it's all just like it's all one-sided story. There's about as much variety to the Western genre as you can find. Some are about kidnappings. Some are about chasing gold, like Treasure of the Sierra Madre. Some are about defending a town, like in Magnificent Seven. Some are like about just killing one guy who's a nuisance, The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance. Some are about old rivalries, old feuds, being or new feuds, like in High Noon. You know, these are really um like you don't get this sort of streamlined, overly filtered approach until the spaghetti westerns, when there's a kind of a high opera approach to these films where the emotions are really expressed on camera visually, and the music is drowning out everything, and you have these close-ups of the tense facial expressions of all the characters, and the music just pounds like, or maybe like that, but sweeping string sections, crescendoing and diminuendoing or whatever, diminuending. Or anyway, you get it. They're just scores all over the place, and then it's just trying to hammer in the intensity these shots are presenting of the close-ups of these rustic, cowboy characters. A lot of them are villains, rough around the edges. Um, probably hungry, don't have any money, and they're trying to kill someone, steal their shit, and they do, or they die in the process. A lot of these, Italian spaghetti westerns, they didn't even shoot in the United States. They shot in Italy or Spain, somewhere, but not in America. They were produced in Italy. They couldn't shoot them in faraway places. It wasn't like now where you can rent anywhere camera equipment. from you back then you had to like kind of know who could give you the deal or own the company. Communication was a lot slower. So, a phone call, whatever, a letter, whatever. Communication was definitely slower, and so they would shoot closer to home, and then that means that the film styles are more regional. And the spaghetti westerns were really gritty or gruesome or all of it. It was blood, sweat, and tears, and someone always died, and someone was always seeking a vendetta against someone else, and they confront each other, and there's a duel, and they almost like slow down the duel to have these suspenseful, you know, um, shots where it's like shot reverse shot of of guys staring at each other, about to grab their guns, duke it out. Very like in a film like Man Shot Liberty Valance, that kind of pitched, intense screen time doesn't exist because it's sort of supposed to be like more naturalistic. It just lets the shot take care, lets the sequence sort of resolve on its own. And these spaghetti westerns, they really want to like sort of seduce you into the moment, which is funny because you're just watching people kill each other. But it's like opera. You have to feel. It's just like opera. You have to feel the emotion as they are feeling it. In media res, and or in vivo situ or whatever. And Clint Eastwood somehow got his name doing these, even though he was American. He was he had a sort of a desirable look for the typical anti-hero rogue character who sort of mysterious stranger kind of character. He always played these like stranger characters, or usually did, who kind of ride into town and just take care of business and ride out into the sunset. But that was an intensification or a distillation of what Western was. It was like a stereotype on acid. And to be fair, a lot of the westerns during this period, not these ones, but some of the ones made in America, were associated with the free love, hippy dippy sort of electric acid Kool-Aid test scene. So these the 60s were a really controversial time for westerns, but you wouldn't know it now. Nowadays you'd think that they were almost like the high point or something. Like they were the pinnacle. The fact of the matter is that every era has a certain attitude that it decides to take that distinguish itself from prior eras, and people who are involved in the earlier films don't like the new era. That's just the circle of life. It's history, living history. Um, just like the people who pre-existed the Hays Code, they didn't like what the Hays Code was doing. The people with the Hays Code um, didn't like some of the people who were getting tired of the Hays Code and were subverting it low key. And then the people that subverted the Hays Code low key in the early 60s, late 50s, they didn't like the people that blatantly subverted the Hays Code in the late 60s, early 70s. So it becomes like it's these distinctions become rather obtuse and overly subtle. But that's just sort of the dialectic of one attitude shifting to another attitude, and as a corollary, it keeps shifting again. And I'm telling you, there's a rich tapestry of the eternal return with Western films. They just sort of constantly reiterate each other and sort of comment on their forebears and remark on them. And if you can watch a movie in 1992 like Unforgiven, and then you could see a movie that was made in 1962, Liberty Valance. You could see what is that, 40 years difference? 30? 30, I think it's 30. You can see the 30 years difference. But you also can, and you could. Oh, that's all you would see was how different they were, or you could see 30 years difference, but then see that they're actually the same movie. Because you wouldn't. I mean, you would ignore the difference and just see everything that wasn't different. So on some level, they're all rebelling against prior eras, but on some level, they're barely even changing form at all. So that's where the subtlety in appreciating westerns is. It's not so much is the character delivering, comedic relief lines. Yes, they all do or should at times, but that doesn't mean that's not really what drives home my interest in westerns. And I don't think anyone who's serious about westerns is looking at it from such like a sort of sophomore consumer level. I think they're viewing it more as a forever return, the immortality of the archetype in all stories, in all places, and in all times. Because in a funny way, like I was saying about high opera is kind of like this grand mythology that the aristocracy had in Europe. Westerns are a little bit like the mythology that the Americans have for themselves. Maybe a little bit long in the tooth, but they reflect these sort of core values at work, mechanically sort of foisting against each other and violating each other, and then returning the form. That's what these westerns do. They're mythologic in their structure, and I think they're one of the most deliberate genres at doing that, and that's why I love them. I mean, you could say it about horror movies, maybe. Say about noir, maybe. Giallo, Italian Giallo films, maybe. I just don't think that those films have the same level of implication. But I do think that they have an implication that is socially and societally pertinent. But it's at this level of like um, of mental illness or something, like the paranoias that we see expressed in horror films. That's like mentally ill a little. But I guess like if you're a child and you're scared of something, it makes sense. Or if you're suspicious of the opposite sex, okay, well, noir is good because noirs always explore the the ill at easeness between men and women that does permeate society, especially in the last 100 years, or at least typical the forms that are typical to the last 100 years. A western though is a little more oblique. Western's a little like, to be fair, I mean, Western has a problem where it feels a little too disconnected, a little too strategic, by design. But I think the beauty in a Western film is that it shows sort of the almost like the religious beliefs of people in society, not just the paranoia or the suspiciousness of these contentions of sort of man versus spirit and man versus woman or whatever. But Western is kind of like man versus man, like it's but in an equal sort of way, like the same entity versus the same entity. It's not as lopsided. And so that oblique, you know, demonstration of balance and the eventual sort of wobbling of the balance is what makes westerns, I think, have this ultimate sort of moralistic and dramaturgical suspense. It just doesn't really, penetrate into other genre films like monster movies or science fiction. Science fiction is a commentary about the way we interact with ourselves in society, because the technology of any society is what defines how we work and what we do at a day-to-day level. So there's always going to be some hermeneutical callback in exploring any of these excellent genres, especially these early, Hays Code era genres. However, I don't think they aren't explored. I think a lot of them are explored too much at the expense of looking at westerns, because westerns really dial in to what makes people tick at the level of pure competition. It's a competitive um, memorialization, even if it's just of some sort of spear in the air, the zeitgeist, if you will, in 1963, 1983. It's not necessarily anything to do with your life, but it could be. Often they do represent their era more than they represent another era. I'm always trying to find good westerns, and I find that sometimes you have to look in places you don't want to look. I saw this movie, The Assassination of Jesse James, by Coward Robert Ford, 2007. It's also the same year as the 310 the Yuma remake. It's it's almost like a noir film, but in a Western setting. It's a very interesting technique they did. I don't really think it qualifies as a Western in a sense, but I do think that it was an excellent film in its own right. It just had a totally novel kind of style, or at least a style that I thought was somewhat contrived and unusual. Um, Australian westerns do exist. There was a great one from the 70s. I mean, not a great one, but a fun one with Mick Jagger as the lead, playing an Australian criminal who runs a gang. I forget almost everything about it, though. There's another one called The Proposition, with starring Ray Winstone and Guy Pearce. That one's a little more interesting. It was a recent film, fairly recent, last 20 years. Um, Another one that's good is uh, Red Rider. What am I thinking of? Sometimes you want to look at it really helps to look at the remakes, like the True Grit remake, how it deviated from the um, original True Grit, or the Magnificent Seven remake and how that deviated from the original Magnificent Seven. Because some of these movies never get remade, and then when they do, you're always like wondering, like, why did they feel the need to retell this story? And if they do need to retell it, what would they change about it to make it? And would it even be the same story? Um, Keep in mind, a lot of these films are so popular that they were sort of transmogrified into a whole different genre by Akira Kurosawa, the Japanese director, the most famous Japanese director. He made Yojimbo, which was based on Django. Not Django Unchained, but the original Django. And Yojimbo is one of my favorite movies, and it's literally just rehashed of Django. It's about a guy who takes on a whole town because he's, you know, he has the ability to boss everyone around, but he's cool about it. He's just the ultimate lone warrior, lone wolf. Yojimbo and Django, similar premise. The Kurosawa also did the Seven Samurai, which is literally riffing off and basically plagiarizing Magnificent Seven, but he did it to a stupendous effect. I mean, that's one of the best movies of all time. He did it with a few of his films. He was very interested in the honor code that the cowboys or the gunslingers had, and he was interested in sort of morphing it into a Japanese feudal format. The irony is that I think the cowboys, the filmmakers who made those cowboy films, they got a little bit of it from like medieval chivalry. So making the film, and maybe Kurosawa was aware of this, but making the film, like dialed back into a chivalric situation in feudal Japan seems a little bit like reverse engineering the whole thing, because it probably was starting out as like sort of the Song of Roland anyway, right? Or like the Tale of Taliesin. King Arthur's knights, you know, Parsifal, right? Uh, Heck, even in German, right? The Nibelungenlied, or whatever. Nibelungenlied. That's it. With Siegfried, you have these like bold and bright characters, and they lead the charge, and they face this consequence or that. Sometimes they falter, sometimes they win, and that's everything. And it's the horse culture that really drives it home for me. The magic Kurosawa did was he was able to convey all of that without having really any horses in his movies. But the strongest commonality is that they have weapons, they have horses, and they have a gang, and they're in nature. I mean, the big four. Sometimes there's a woman, a damsel. I guess that'd be five. 41 minutes. I feel like I've spilled the beans on westerns. I don't know what to say. I mean, if you want to make a western, you got to look at the production design of these things. Like, what kind of guns are they using? How do they load the guns? What kind of calibers? Were the guns available in certain colors? What kind of leather holsters did the guns have? What kind of leather, straps did someone wear? And then was it a bandolier, or was it with bandolier shotgun shelled? And it was a bandolier that did they have two? Could they wear two? Or did they have did they have a pouch for a knife? The sartorial logistics in westerns are really involved. Not always like excessively so, but appreciate that there's some complexity to it. If you're trying to replicate this stuff, because it's really easy to fuck up a genre film. Really, like, horror movies have it the worst. People always want to make their own home video horror film, and it's like they just dogpile a never ending heap of trash flicks, and it's like, I mean, pornography is probably like not like is like at least a little easier to make. I mean, so it's probably less likely to ruin it, but like that's kind of horror films are like. It's like they're so easy to ruin that like it's almost at the level of pornography. And then the other thing is trying to understand the sociology. Like, don't just think that every western is about like a saloon where a guy walks in, plays cards, throws cards in, and shoots someone and walks out and like rides off in the sunset. That's like basic bitch perspective. You want to think about like, okay, what's the store next door? Is it do they make candles? What do they make? Do they make barrels? Maybe they don't make anything. Maybe they just sell, potions. What did they do there? Is there a store? Maybe there isn't a store. Okay, well, where is one? Because it's not just going to be some fucking saloon, right? How does the saloon? Who supplies the saloon? You know, how much traffic is there in and out of town? And if there is traffic, what's the likelihood that people would meet if they're leaving, or returning? Why would people even be there in the first place? And what character of people? Is it always the same character, or is it a mixed character? Sometimes it's a lot of criminals. Sometimes it's almost no criminals. Sometimes it's everyone's kind of in the middle. You don't know who's who, and sometimes you do know who's who, but they're still mixed in anyway. Sometimes a character is just a piano player, and sometimes that piano player is also the sheriff. Sometimes there's a sheriff who runs the town, but sometimes there's actually a marshal too, and he bosses the sheriff around every once in a while. Or the sheriff is drunk and an incompetent, ineffectual buffoon. So it isn't like it isn't necessarily as typecasted as you might want it to be. Going in thinking you understand it already. I wouldn't assume you understand the genre already if you haven't seen a fair amount of movies. You and I've seen, probably more than a fair amount. I can't remember every movie I've seen. And I still feel like I don't understand it as much as like I should. I feel like I don't even feel that qualified to really talk about it. But the fact of the matter is that someone has to be talking about it, because it's really like it's sort of a dying genre, in the sense that in order to make it, it does cost a fair amount. You need to get, and there has to be enough interest in the production side for people to bother. Um, and they don't make as many as they used to, by far. Now, is it an impossible thing to make in the future? No. Like, as long as there is a future in film making with all the same bells and whistles as there is now, then yeah, they could feasibly make another Western. It's not hard to research in English. It's 1800s, all that stuff, all the documents are written in English, and sometimes it's really enjoyable to read. Some of the best writing is written in the 1800s. And why? Because it was a more careful time. People were careful about how they spoke. So don't just think it's a zero-sum game where you learn something and then you lose something. It's an always ever evolving discipline of study, and not just study, of recreation. You'd be surprised by the kinds of insights you gain about your own life from learning about the Wild West, about your own character, about the materials that you live with, how close you are to the earth, how crafty you are, how physical you are, how respected you are. All these things that, like, actually, I think we do think about in our lives. We're not really confronted with them unless we're sort of doing something like watching a Western, a good Western. Or yeah, I mean, maybe we live in a world where we're like, maybe you run, you hike a lot, or you're an athlete or something, and you do confront these kinds of things. But I think a lot of us don't. And watching a Western is a good way to sort of begin to appreciate it in a broad, all-encompassing kind of interface. I won't say platform, but the interface of viewing a Western is it's like the art of nostalgia. It really is in the same league as, like, the Japanese tea ceremony. It has to be done just right, and with just enough due diligence that you don't feel like you're making a fool out of yourself for even bothering, but that you can just sort of sit back and settle in and enjoy the ride. And now I want to ride horses. So that tells you everything. All right. Well, I got 48 minutes in. Probably try to get an hour in on this, because I basically finished the lecture. However, I forget how long like a college lecture is. I think it would be like an hour and a half, or an hour 45, or maybe an hour 15. Over an hour though. I think any kind of movie that represents nature in juxtaposition with sort of a diverse and oppositional swath of humanity is in good shape. A lot of those Pirates of the Caribbean movies were kind of like that. They were sort of, I don't know, maybe 1700s, possibly 18, but I think before the Wild West, really. Frontier times, colonial times, right? It's like a little off helter skelter, but they kind of embody the same sort of roguish craftiness and sort of devious, devil may care, quick on the feet thinking. I think it's any adventure movie, as long as it's not like a space age kind of romp or something, would probably qualify to have the same sort of therapeutic benefits these Western movies have. The only standout thing about Westerns is that there are a lot of them, and so you can kind of binge watch them. And then also, but then because some of them are like beyond comprehension, sometimes they're just too old to film, or the style is a little odd, or the music, something's a little wrong with like the music or the costumes or the choice of actors, casting, because there can be any number of issues with any one film. You can kind of backpedal them, or sorry, you can kind of back burner them, and watch them on like a home projector. Get like a $70 projector. Watch a black and white movie. Or you watch watch a CinemaScope movie, whatever you can muster. But like being able to do that versus just watching the latest, Marvel. It used to be you'd watch. There's like 4 different kinds of annoying B movie blockbuster. There was like Transformers, um, Fast and Furious, maybe like Pirates of the Caribbean, and then Marvel. Now it's like you just have Marvel, right? Or anime. People love anime, but those are they're so disembodied. They're cartoons. Marvel is effectively like a cartoon. They're just like they're glitchy. The pacing is disturbing, and it kind of feel like they're being violated watching them, just because the pacing is so campy and absurd. Um, I mean, whatever inspires you to get back to nature, um, is I think better than something that inspires you to sort of be suspicious or paranoid and angry, or super judgmental. And I think some of these westerns are soothing because they're in nature, and there's something very like cross-cultural about that. And I don't know how you are about environmental regulation and any want any there's this idea of like the noble savage living in the wilderness. Like, it's a philosophical idea that stems from Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and he was an Enlightenment, Swiss Enlightenment writer, one of the best and most famous. And this idea, like the noble savage is like freed of the chains that we all live in Western society. It reminds me of the film The Last of the Mohicans, which is also almost a Western, but it's not. It's about a colonial period. But these period films, as long as they're shot in the open breeze, they're gonna lend themselves to kind of this, incredible forthright invitation to becoming a bigger person and broadening horizons to the point that you no longer really feel like an American trapped in the hive, but you start to feel like an animal again, and you start to feel like a wanderer again, an adventurer again, an explorer, even maybe more an explorer of the self than historically explorers have been, but you're still exploring, and you're not bootstrapped to the fucking I don't know what bootstrapped means actually. Hog tied to the fucking television, or what's worse, the fucking computer monitor, or the cellular screen. It's like they want you to be mundane. They want you to just circle the drain and not proliferate as an individual, but sort of stagnate as a collective consumer, as part of this, like I said, part of this hive of machine consumption. You are no longer a living form. You are the machine. Reclaim your identity as an animal and as a human, which is something kind of between an animal and a machine. But I think it's infinitely better than both. And on that note, I'll leave you. I didn't make the full hour. I gave you like 10 minutes of not very good poetic musings. But what am I going to do in a lecture like this? Be entirely staid and dry from the lips? Or should I also be, whimsical on occasion? Weather permitting, right? All right. I'm sure I'm driving you crazy with my nonsense, but I'd rather drive you crazy with my nonsense than have you drive yourself a little too much sense, if you catch my meaning. So anyway, cheers. Take it easy.